Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The beverage cart was heavy, but the silence at 35,000 feet was heavier. Flight 828 to London was a red-eye, the kind where most passengers drug themselves to sleep before we even hit cruising altitude. The cabin was bathed in that dim, artificial blue light, and the only sound was the steady hum of the jet engines. But the man in seat 14B wasn't sleeping. He was shivering. It was a violent, bone-rattling shake that made his plastic tray table chatter against the armrest. I remember leaning in, keeping my voice low, asking if he needed water or a blanket. He slowly tilted his head up, and his eyes. God, I will never forget his eyes. They were completely milked over, devoid of any humanity, leaking a thick, black fluid down his pale cheeks. He didn't answer me. He lunged. It wasn't a clumsy stumble. It was a feral, physics-defying snap of muscle and bone. His teeth tore through the throat of the woman sleeping next to him before I could even scream. Arterial spray painted the overhead bins in a horrific arc of crimson. That was our one. There is nowhere to run in a metal tube suspended in the stratosphere. No police to call. No doors to open. Just a 40-foot aisle, 180 passengers, and an infection that turned ordinary humans into apex predators in less than 60 seconds. Panic doesn't look like it does in the movies. It's not just screaming, it's a terrifying, claustrophobic crush of bodies. People were trampling each other, clawing at the emergency exits that couldn't be opened, begging for a salvation that wasn't coming. What followed wasn't a flight. It was a flying slaughterhouse. I retreated backward, shoving the heavy metal beverage cart to block the aisle, a desperate barricade against the tide of blood-soaked passengers. I watched a businessman I had just served a martini to rip the face off a flight marshal. The infection spread exponentially. One bite. 60 seconds. Another monster. We lost the cockpit 10 minutes later. The co-pilot, hearing the screams, made the fatal mistake of cracking the reinforced cabin door to look. They poured in like a flood of rabid animals. The plane didn't gently descend. It plummeted. The G-force pinned me to the galley floor, surrounded by scattered ice cubes and miniature liquor bottles. Waiting for the impact that would end it all. But we didn't just crash. We slammed into the tarmac at JFK at over 200 miles an hour. Skidding through the perimeter fences and violently colliding with the international terminal. The screech of tearing metal was deafening, followed by the catastrophic heat of ignited jet fuel. I survived the impact because I was wedged in the reinforced rear galley. When I finally kicked open the buckled service door, choking on toxic black smoke and aviation fuel, I tumbled out onto the polished concourse floor of Terminal 4. But if I thought the nightmare was over, I was dead wrong. Crawling out of the wreckage, my uniform torn and soaked in someone else's blood, I looked out through the shattered floor-to-ceiling glass of the airport. The horror on the plane was just a localized preview. The sky above New York City wasn't glowing from streetlights. It was burning. Columns of thick, black smoke choked the skyline. Sirens wailed in a deafening, overlapping chorus of absolute defeat. The terminal itself was a war zone. Thousands of stranded travelers were running for their lives, hunted by swarms of the infected. TSA agents, baggage handlers, families, they were all being torn apart in the food courts and at the boarding gates. The agonizing screams echoed off the vaulted ceilings, mixing with the automated intercom voice that calmly repeated, "Please do not leave your baggage unattended." The juxtaposition of that polite, automated voice against the backdrop of an active apocalypse shattered something inside my mind. My training kicked in, but not the airline's standard operating procedure. This was primal. This was survival. I gripped a heavy metal fire extinguisher I had pulled from the galley wall, my knuckles white, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This is my account of the first 12 hours. The 12 hours where the world didn't just end, it turned inside out. If you're listening to this on a shortwave radio, know this: the airports are death traps. Do not go to the evacuation zones. I am Sarah, former senior cabin crew. I've learned how to kill. I've learned how to hide. And I'm going to tell you exactly how I made it through the longest night in human history. The screaming started in economy class. At first, I thought it was just a severe medical emergency. We were still at the gate, boarding Flight 409 to London. The seatbelt sign was off, the cabin hummed with that dull, anticipatory chatter, and I was up in first class, pouring a pre-departure champagne. Then that sound. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was a wet, tearing noise, followed by a shriek so primal it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I dropped the bottle. It shattered, champagne foaming over the blue carpet, but nobody noticed. They were all looking toward the back. My training kicked in automatically. Assess, report, manage. I grabbed the intercom phone, my thumb hovering over the button to call the flight deck, but before I could press it, a man burst through the curtain separating first class from business. He was wearing a gray suit, but the front of it was painted a wet, glistening crimson. He wasn't running to escape. He was lunging. His jaw hung slack, dislocated, a thick string of blackish saliva swinging from his chin. He slammed into an elderly woman in row 2, his teeth sinking directly into her neck. The cabin exploded into absolute pandemonium. Passengers scrambled over seats, trampling each other in the narrow aisles. I stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds. That's all the time you have before shock becomes a death sentence. The intercom was dead. The flight deck door was sealed shut from the inside. I was cut off, trapped in a metal tube with whatever nightmare was spreading row by row. I looked down and saw a heavy, metal fire extinguisher secured near the galley bulkhead. I ripped it from its bracket. It felt cold and heavy in my hands, a grounding weight in a world that was suddenly spinning out of control. The suited man, his face now a mask of torn flesh and gore, snapped his head toward me. His eyes were wrong. The whites were gone, completely flooded with burst capillaries, making them look like polished rubies. He scrambled over the armrests, ignoring the shrieks of the dying woman beneath him. He didn't walk. He propelled himself forward with a jerky, spider-like unnatural speed. I didn't think. I swung the extinguisher with every ounce of strength I had. The heavy steel cylinder connected with the side of his skull with a sickening crack. He went down hard, twitching on the galley floor, dark blood pooling around his head. I didn't wait to see if he would get back up. I hit the emergency door release. The heavy mechanical gears ground together, and the cabin door swung open into the jet bridge. I stepped out, expecting safety, expecting security guards and paramedics. Instead, I stepped into hell. The jet bridge was a slaughterhouse. Fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a strobe effect over the carnage. Luggage was scattered everywhere. And crawling among the discarded bags were people. At least, there used to be people. A TSA agent was pinned against the glass wall by 2 teenagers in matching tracksuits. They were tearing at his uniform, pulling away chunks of fabric and meat with ravenous desperation. The glass was smeared with thick, rusty streaks. The smell hit me then, a vile, coppery stench mixed with voided bowels and cheap terminal coffee. It was the smell of the end of the world. I pressed my back against the corrugated metal wall of the bridge, sliding down into a crouch. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. I had to get to the terminal, but the tunnel was blocked by the feeding frenzy. I clutched the fire extinguisher to my chest like a shield. I needed a distraction. I looked back into the plane. The screams were dying down, replaced by a wet chorus of chewing and guttural snarls. The infected were starting to stand up. The elderly woman from row 2 dragged herself into the galley, her neck a ruined, gaping crater. She looked at me with those same blood-flooded eyes. There was no time to hesitate. I pulled the pin on the fire extinguisher, aimed it into the cabin, and squeezed the handle. A massive cloud of dense, white chemical foam erupted into the narrow space, blinding the dead and filling the galley. I threw the empty canister into the jet bridge, right at the group feeding on the TSA agent. It clattered loudly against the metal floor. The teenagers snapped their heads up, their mouths smeared with gore, and hissed. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of a rabid animal. As they lunged toward the rolling canister, I bolted. I kept low, my sensible uniform heels discarded long ago, running in bare feet across the cold, sticky floor of the jet bridge. I burst through the doors into Terminal B. The sprawling, high-ceilinged concourse, usually a beacon of modern travel, was a war zone. The massive departure screens above were flashing red with a single word, emergency. The automated voice over the PA system was looping a calm, almost mocking message. Please remain calm. Security personnel are handling a localized disturbance. Do not run. But everyone was running. Or dying. It was a stampede of terror. Hundreds of people were bottlenecked at the security checkpoints, crushing each other against the glass barriers. And tearing through the back of the crowd were the infected. They moved like a fluid, violent wave, pulling people down by their hair, their clothes, their limbs. It was a harvest. I realized instantly that the main exits were a death trap. You don't survive a crowd panic, let alone one driven by bloodthirsty monsters. I needed to get off the main concourse. I needed to find the service corridors. I remembered my security clearance badge clipped to my lanyard. It was my only ticket out of the slaughterhouse. I ducked behind a massive, overturned duty-free kiosk, glass crunching under my bare feet. A woman crawled around the edge of the display. She reached out to me. Her hand was missing 3 fingers. Help me! She gurgled, blood bubbling past her lips. I wanted to help. God, I wanted to pull her up. But then I saw the bite mark on her shoulder. The veins around the wound were already turning a toxic, bruised black, webbing out across her pale skin. The transformation was fast. Too fast. I watched the humanity drain from her eyes, replaced by that feral, empty hunger. I didn't wait for her to lunge. I grabbed a heavy, unbroken bottle of high-end vodka from the debris, raised it high, and brought it down on her head. I shattered the bottle, and I shattered my own innocence with it. I wasn't just Sarah the flight attendant anymore. I was a survivor. And the first 12 hours had only just begun. I wiped the vodka and blood from my face, clutching the jagged bottleneck like a dagger, and looked toward the hidden employee door at the end of the terminal. It was 50 yards away. 50 yards of pure, unadulterated nightmare to cross. My hands were completely steady. I took a deep breath of the metallic, smoke-filled air. I had a weapon. I had a destination. Now I just had to run. I pushed off the cold terrazzo floor, my low heels discarded somewhere near gate 14. Barefoot was better. Barefoot was quiet. The 50 yards to the employee-only access door felt like an entire marathon stretched across a landscape of hell. I darted behind a toppled check-in kiosk, my breath catching in my throat as a man in a torn business suit sprinted past. He wasn't running to escape. He was hunting. His jaw was unhinged, hanging at an impossible angle, and a thick rope of dark, coagulated blood swung like a pendulum from his chin. I pressed my back against the metal casing of the kiosk, my knuckles white around the jagged neck of the vodka bottle. The terminal around me was a cacophony of absolute terror. Screams didn't just echo, they layered over one another in a deafening choir of final moments. The PA system was still chiming its pleasant, automated melody, cheerfully reminding passengers that the moving walkway was ending. The contrast was enough to drive someone completely insane. I couldn't let it break my focus. I had to compartmentalize the horror. I peeked around the cold metal of the kiosk. 30 yards left. Between me and the gray, unassuming door lay a graveyard of abandoned rolling luggage, spilled duty-free bags. And things I didn't want to look at too closely. Bodies. Some were completely still, their unseeing eyes staring up at the harsh fluorescent lights. Others twitched, horrific spasms of whatever virus had hijacked their nervous systems working through their dying muscles. I mapped my route. From the kiosk to a tip-over luggage cart, then behind an oversized trash receptacle, and a straight dash to the keypad. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, picturing the layout of the back corridors. As a senior flight attendant, I knew the labyrinth of this airport better than anyone. If I could just get through that door, I could access the service tunnels that connected directly to the tarmac. I opened my eyes. Move. I launched myself forward, keeping my profile low. My bare feet slapped softly against the tile, slipping slightly in something slick and warm that I refused to identify. 10 yards. 15 yards. I reached the luggage cart and slid behind it, my chest heaving, my lungs burning with the exertion. The metallic scent of blood was so thick in the air it tasted like copper pennies on my tongue. Suddenly, a wet, tearing sound echoed right beside me. I slowly turned my head, my neck creeping with dread. Not 3 feet away, obscured by a mountain of spilled Samsonite suitcases, a woman in a floral sundress was crouched over a TSA agent. She was eating. There is a specific, horrifying sound that human teeth make when tearing through raw flesh and dense uniform fabric. It's a sound that doesn't belong in the natural world. The woman paused, her head snapping up. She didn't look, she listened. The virus had clearly amplified their primal senses while entirely stripping away their humanity. Her eyes were milky white, the capillaries burst and bleeding into the sclera. Slowly, she turned her head toward the luggage cart. Toward me. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird in a cage. She let out a low, guttural hiss that vibrated deep in her chest, a sound more reptile than mammal. Then she lunged. I didn't think. Instinct, raw and primitive, took the wheel. As she vaulted over the suitcases, her hands outstretched with broken, bloody fingernails, I thrust the jagged glass of the vodka bottle upward. The impact jarred my arm all the way to the shoulder. The glass sank deep into the soft tissue under her jaw. Hot, blackish blood sprayed across my face and uniform, blinding me in my left eye. She didn't scream. She didn't stop fighting. Her hands clawed at my shoulders, tearing the fabric of my blouse, her teeth snapping inches from my nose. The sheer strength of her was terrifying. It was like fighting a machine that couldn't feel pain. I twisted the broken bottle, screaming through gritted teeth, and shoved her backward with all the leverage I could muster. We crashed into the luggage cart, sending it careening into a row of metal waiting chairs with a deafening crash. The noise was a death sentence. Every infected within a 50-foot radius snapped their attention toward the sound. The woman went limp, the glass having finally severed her spinal cord, but I didn't have a single second to waste. I yanked the bottle free, scrambling over her twitching body, and ran. 20 yards? 10 yards. I didn't look back, but I could hear them. The slap of bare feet, the scramble of ruined shoes on slick tile, the chorus of inhuman shrieks rising behind me like a tidal wave of nightmares. 5 yards. I hit the gray door's shoulder first, my bruised flesh screaming in protest. It was locked. Of course it was locked. My hands shook violently as I punched in the 4-digit employee access code. 0-4-2-7. The red light blinked. Invalid. Come on, come on. I sobbed, glancing over my shoulder. A pack of them, at least half a dozen, were vaulting over the seating areas, their bodies moving with terrifying, reckless speed. They didn't care about breaking bones or tearing ligaments. The virus only demanded forward momentum. I wiped the blood from my eyes and punched the keypad again. 0-4-2-6. A loud, heavy clack echoed from the locking mechanism. The light turned green. I threw my weight against the heavy steel door, tumbling into the pitch-black corridor beyond. I kicked the door shut just as the first heavy thud of a body slammed against the other side. Thud. Thud. Screeches tore through the metal, followed by the frantic scratching of fingernails trying to find a purchase on smooth steel. I slumped against the cold concrete floor, my chest rising and falling in ragged, burning gasps. The darkness of the employee corridor was absolute. I was safe for the moment, but the air here was entirely different. It was stale, smelling of ozone, dust, and industrial floor wax, but underneath that, there was the undeniable, sickening stench of fresh blood. I wasn't alone in the dark. I blindly reached out, my trembling fingers brushing against the cold cinderblock wall, desperately searching for the light switch. When my hand finally found the plastic toggle, I almost didn't want to flick it. Ignorance in the dark felt like a temporary shield. But I needed to see to survive. I pushed the switch up. The long, narrow fluorescent tubes flickered on one by one, buzzing like a hive of angry hornets. The corridor stretched out before me, a stark, industrial contrast to the carpeted luxury of the passenger terminals. But the pristine white cinderblock walls were ruined. Smeared across the paint, from the baseboards to the ceiling, were massive, bloody handprints. They didn't look like they were made by someone trying to stand up. They looked like they were made by someone being violently dragged. At the far end of the hallway, where the corridor turned toward the subterranean baggage sorting facility, a shadow slowly detached itself from the wall. It didn't screech. It didn't rush me. It just stood there, swaying slightly under the flickering lights, holding something long and metallic in its hand. I tightened my slick grip on the bloody neck of my shattered bottle. The real nightmare hadn't been the crowded terminal. The real nightmare was trapped down here with me. The shadow dragged its feet with a sickening, wet friction against the concrete. With every agonizing step forward, the flickering overhead lights revealed terrifying fragments of what it used to be. A neon-striped safety vest, drenched in viscous, dark crimson. A heavy-duty work boot missing its heel. Then, the metallic object scraped against the wall, sending a shower of orange sparks into the dim corridor. It was a massive steel lug wrench. The thing holding it was a baggage handler. Or at least he had been before the virus boiled his brain and hijacked his nervous system. Now, his jaw hung at a completely unnatural angle, dislocated and swaying like a broken hinge. Thick strings of black blood swung from his chin, dripping onto his chest. He didn't roar like the manic, feral things tearing people apart in the terminal above. This one was chillingly silent, its head twitching in small, robotic spasms as its dead eyes locked onto me. I took a slow step backward, the shattered neck of the duty-free vodka bottle trembling in my slick, sweaty palm. The jagged glass was a pathetic defense against a crazed monster armed with solid steel, but it was all I had. The heavy steel wrench screeched against the concrete floor now, a slow, torturous grinding noise that echoed through the subterranean tunnel. My back hit the cold metal of a locked maintenance door. I fumbled for the knob behind my back, praying for a miracle. Locked. Deadbolt. There was nowhere left to run. The handler stopped about 10 feet away. For a split second, it was completely motionless. A terrifying, absolute stillness. Then, its knees buckled slightly, and it launched itself at me with the explosive speed of a rabid animal. The sheer velocity caught me completely off guard. I dove to the right just as the heavy wrench smashed into the metal door exactly where my head had been a fraction of a second prior. The impact rang out like a gunshot, denting the solid steel frame. Before I could scramble to my feet, the creature spun around, its broken jaw snapping wildly, and lunged. Its free hand clamped onto the collar of my torn uniform blouse. The grip was impossibly strong, like a steel vice crushing my collarbone. It yanked me forward, bringing its horrific, mutilated face inches from mine. The smell was suffocating, a sickening cocktail of copper, voided bowels, and rancid meat. Hot, wet breath sprayed across my cheeks as it snapped its bloody teeth at my throat. I shoved my left forearm against its throat, trying desperately to keep those snapping jaws away from my jugular. The creature gurgled, a wet, choking sound, and raised the heavy wrench high above its head for a crushing blow. Pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded my veins. It wasn't bravery, it was the absolute, primal refusal to die in the bowels of an airport. With a scream that tore up my throat, I drove the jagged edge of the broken glass bottle upward, plunging it directly into the soft tissue under the creature's chin. The glass punched deep into its throat, slicing through vocal cords and arteries. A geyser of hot, blackish blood erupted over my hand and face. But it didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. The virus didn't care about blood loss. The wrench began its downward arc. I twisted the glass violently, feeling it grind against the cervical spine, and with a desperate shove, I kicked its knees out from under it. The wrench glanced off my shoulder, sending a shockwave of blinding pain down my left arm, but the mist swung through the creature off balance. We crashed to the floor together in a tangled, bloody heap. I scrambled out from under its thrashing weight, desperately clawing my way across the dirty tiles. The zombie was choking on its own fluids, thrashing wildly as it tried to pull the broken bottle from its neck. But the glass had wedged itself deep into the bone. It gurgled furiously, dropping the wrench to claw at its throat. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself forward, grabbing the heavy steel lug wrench from the blood-slicked floor. It was incredibly heavy, the cold metal grounding me in the terrifying reality of the moment. As the monster began to push itself back up to its knees, blind rage and terror taking over, I swung the wrench with every ounce of strength I had left in my exhausted body. The heavy steel connected with the side of its skull with a sickening, wet crunch. The creature collapsed instantly, its limbs twitching for a few seconds before going completely still. I stood over the body, my chest heaving, my breath echoing in the silent corridor. I was drenched in sweat and gore, my shoulder throbbing with a dull, agonizing ache where the wrench had clipped me. I stared at the blood dripping from the steel tool in my hands. The flight attendant who had served coffee and checked seatbelts just a few hours ago was dead. In her place was something much colder, something forged in the absolute meat grinder of this outbreak. I turned away from the corpse and faced the entrance to the baggage sorting facility. The heavy plastic flaps hanging over the entrance were stained with bloody handprints. Beyond them lay a cavernous, subterranean maze of giant conveyor belts, scanning machines, and towering piles of lost luggage. The perfect place for things to hide. I gripped the wrench tighter, my knuckles turning white. As I stepped through the heavy plastic strips, the air grew instantly colder. The massive room was lit only by the emergency backup lights, casting long, menacing shadows across the endless mechanical tracks. Suddenly, a deafening mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. The automated systems had just kicked on. The massive rubber belts began to groan and move, carrying suitcases along the winding tracks. But it wasn't just luggage riding the belts. As a red suitcase tumbled past my section, an arm fell over the side. Then a head. Mutilated bodies were being fed through the system, dumped from the upper terminals. And from the dark corners of the sorting room, I heard the rustling. The mechanical noise had woken them up. Dozens of shadows began to slowly rise from behind the towering mounds of luggage, their glowing eyes reflecting the emergency lights. I had just walked into the hive. The sheer scale of the horror unfolding in front of me paralyzed every muscle in my body. The baggage sorting room was a cavernous industrial nightmare, and I was standing dead center in its lowest level. The mechanical hum and screech of the conveyor belts were deafening, but it couldn't drown out the wet, guttural rattling coming from the throats of the infected. They were rising from the floor, peeling themselves off piles of abandoned luggage like insects disturbed under a rock. Through the dim, amber glow of the emergency strobes, I could see them clearly. These weren't the slow, stumbling corpses from old movies. Their movements were violently erratic, muscles twitching and snapping as the virus hijacked their nervous systems. Some were passengers in torn vacation clothes. Others wore the neon-reflective vests of the ground crew. All of them had eyes that caught the flashing lights, reflecting a vacant, predatory shine. I pressed my spine against the cold concrete of a support pillar, willing myself to become invisible. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I was terrified the sound alone would give me away. A few feet from my hiding spot, a towering mound of suitcases shifted. A woman in a shredded floral dress dragged herself over a shattered hard-shell bag. Her jaw hung at an impossible, grotesque angle, resting against her collarbone. She paused, sniffing the stagnant, fuel-scented air. The only thing masking my scent was the overwhelming stench of copper and voided bowels filling the room. Above us, the conveyor system groaned, and another heavy thud echoed through the chamber. A mutilated body plummeted from the upper terminal chutes, slamming violently onto the sorting belt. The sudden noise and fresh arrival of flesh acted like a dinner bell. The infected shrieked in unison, a chorus of high-pitched, gargling screams that made my ears ring, and swarmed the belt. They climbed over each other in a frantic, rabid pile, tearing into the fresh corpse with bare hands and teeth. The sickening sounds of ripping fabric and snapping cartilage filled the air. It was the most revolting thing I had ever witnessed, but it was also my only window of opportunity. With their attention diverted to the feeding frenzy, I looked for an exit. On the far side of the sorting floor, past rows of dormant mechanical tracks, was a heavy steel fire door marked with a glowing green exit sign. It was at least 50 yards away, through a maze of scattered luggage and wandering infected who hadn't joined the pile. I took a deep breath, tasting the metallic rot in the air, and stepped out from behind the pillar. Every step was agonizingly calculated. I kept my knees bent, rolling my weight from heel to toe, navigating the narrow pathways between the towering walls of bags. I had to step over discarded duty-free bags, shattered laptops, and pools of thick, congealing blood. My slip-on flight attendant shoes were completely inadequate for this, slick with gore and threatening to send me sliding with every movement. A few yards to my left, a ramp worker with a missing arm aimlessly bashed his head against a jammed sorting machine. Thud. 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 I kept my eyes locked on the green exit sign, moving closer. 10 yards. 20 yards. I was halfway there. Then my luck ran out. As I squeezed past the precariously stacked cart of oversized luggage, the sleeve of my blazer caught the loose strap of a heavy canvas duffel bag. I tried to pull back, but the fabric was tangled in the cart's wire mesh. The duffel shifted, throwing the entire stack off balance. Time seemed to slow down as a massive, hard-shell golf club case toppled off the very top. I lunged to catch it, but it was too heavy. It hit the concrete floor with a deafening, plastic crack that echoed like a gunshot over the hum of the conveyor belts. The feeding frenzy at the main belt stopped instantly. The wet tearing sound ceased. The ramp worker stopped bashing his head. Absolute, suffocating silence fell over the room for a split second, save for the mechanical whir of the machinery. Then, dozens of heads snapped in my direction. The amber strobe light flashed, illuminating their blood-soaked faces and hollow, predatory eyes. They saw me. A collective, blood-curdling shriek erupted from the horde. They didn't walk, they lunged. Adrenaline, pure and blinding, flooded my veins. I sprinted, kicking the golf case into the path of the first infected, a businessman in a ruined suit, sending him tumbling hard to the ground. But there were too many. They spilled over the luggage carts like a wave of rotting meat, their broken limbs propelling them forward with terrifying speed. I scrambled over a mound of suitcases, slipping and sliding as the pile shifted beneath my weight. Fingers grazed the ankle of my shoe. I kicked back violently, feeling my heel connect with a soft, yielding face. A spray of black blood coated the back of my leg as the creature shrieked, falling backward into the swarm. The fire door was still 20 yards away, but a fresh wave of the infected poured out from a side corridor, cutting off my path entirely. I was boxed in. To my right was a towering brick wall, to my left, the primary conveyor belt carrying bags into the dark. Yawning mouth of an oversized X-ray scanner tunnel. The belt was moving fast, disappearing behind heavy, overlapping rubber flaps. It was a blind gamble, a one-way trip into claustrophobic darkness, but it was the only direction left. Without hesitating, I threw myself onto the moving rubber track. I landed hard on my stomach, the wind knocked out of my lungs, wedged between a massive Samsonite suitcase and a crushed cardboard box. The infected crashed into the side of the conveyor system behind me. Several tried to climb onto the moving belt. One woman managed to drag her upper half onto the track, her rotting fingers clawing wildly at the fabric of my skirt. I scrambled backward on my elbows, kicking frantically at her hands. The mechanical rollers at the edge of the belt caught the sleeve of her blouse. With a sickening crunch, her arm was pulled down into the gears. The machine shrieked in metallic agony, grinding against bone and flesh. She didn't even scream in pain. She just kept snapping her bloody teeth at me as the machinery swallowed her shoulder, jamming the belt's side track. I was carried away from the horrific scene, moving inexorably toward the dark tunnel. The heavy black rubber flaps brushed over my face and shoulders, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness. The air inside the scanner tube was stiflingly hot, smelling of burned ozone and dusty rubber. The ceiling of the tunnel was mere inches from my nose. I had to press myself entirely flat to keep from being scraped against the metal roof. I was riding a mechanical vein deep into the bowels of the airport, completely blind, surrounded by the unknown contents of 100 suitcases. But the horror wasn't over. Over the rhythmic clatter of the conveyor rollers beneath me, I heard a sound that chilled me to my very core. The heavy rubber flaps at the tunnel's entrance swished open. Then again. And again. Wet, dragging sounds echoed in the confined metal tube. Guttural clicking noises vibrated against the steel walls. They were crawling into the tunnel after me. The claustrophobia hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't stand up, I couldn't turn around, and I had nowhere to run. I was trapped in a metal coffin, slowly moving forward, while the monsters slithered through the dark right behind me. My hands frantically searched the moving belt in the pitch black, desperate for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers brushed against the cold, hard plastic of a heavy equipment case just as the first infected let out a guttural hiss mere feet from my boots. My fingers closed around the molded handle of the heavy equipment case just as a decaying hand clamped down onto my left ankle. The grip was shockingly strong, the filthy fingernails biting straight through my sheer pantyhose and scraping deeply against my bare skin. The creature hissed, a wet, rattling sound that vibrated through the claustrophobic darkness of the conveyor tunnel. The stench of spoiled meat and copper hit me so hard I gagged. I didn't think, I just reacted. I hoisted the heavy plastic case with both trembling hands, twisting my torso as much as the cramped, moving chute would allow, and brought it down blindly toward the horrific sound. The case connected with a sickening, hollow crunch. The agonizing grip on my ankle loosened instantly, replaced by a wet, chaotic thrashing. The conveyor belt kept grinding forward, carrying me deeper into the belly of the airport, but I didn't stop swinging. I bashed the case downward again and again, slamming it into whatever was crawling up behind me in the pitch black until the thrashing abruptly stopped, leaving only the dull, mechanical hum of the conveyor motor. My chest heaved, pulling in stale, dusty air. The darkness was suffocating. I had no idea where this endless rubber belt was taking me, only that it was sloping at a sharp downward angle. Suddenly, a sliver of pale yellow light pierced the gloom ahead. The ceiling of the chute began to rise. I dropped the bloodied equipment case and flattened myself against the rubber belt, squinting against the sudden intrusion of harsh light. The rubber track dropped off abruptly into thin air. I tumbled forward, free-falling for a terrifying second before crashing down onto a massive pile of canvas duffel bags and hard-shell suitcases. I scrambled off the mountain of luggage, my knees scraping against cold, unforgiving concrete. I had been dumped into the subterranean baggage sorting facility. It was a cavernous, industrial nightmare of interlocking belts, steel chutes, and towering metal racks. Emergency lights bathed the massive underground room in an eerie, flickering amber glow, casting long, distorted shadows. The noise down here was utterly deafening, a chaotic chorus of mechanical whirring, grinding gears, and automated alarms. But beneath the mechanical din, there was something else. A chorus of shuffling footsteps and low, guttural moans that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I ducked behind a structural pillar, pressing my back flat against the concrete, my heart hammering against my ribs. Peeking around the rough edge, my blood ran completely cold. The sorting floor was absolutely teeming with them. Baggage handlers in high-visibility vests, airport security personnel, and what looked like terrified passengers. Their clothes were torn, their vests stained terrifyingly dark. They moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, bumping into stationary luggage carts. Their heads snapping in random directions as they endlessly searched for fresh meat. I was trapped in the subterranean levels, completely surrounded by a sea of the ravenous undead. I looked back at the pile of luggage. The heavy equipment case had tumbled down the chute with me, and one of the latches had popped open on impact. I crawled forward on my stomach and reached inside. Nestled in the protective foam was expensive professional photography gear. My hands bypassed the delicate lenses and immediately gripped the base of a heavy, solid steel lighting tripod. It was nearly 3 feet long when collapsed, icy cold, and incredibly dense. Right now, it was the greatest weapon in the world. I gripped it tight. I frantically scanned the perimeter. About 50 yards away, past a labyrinth of idle conveyor belts, I spotted a heavy metal security door marked with a glowing red exit sign. Maintenance stairs. If I could reach it, I could bypass the sorting floor entirely. But standing directly between me and that door were at least 20 infected. I took a deep breath, tasting dust and sheer terror. I began to move, using the giant steel stanchions and overflowing baggage carts as cover. Timing my steps with the loudest mechanical clanks of the surviving machinery. The smell down here was atrocious, a concentrated cloud of biological rot. I slipped behind a mountain of oversized golf bags, holding my breath as a grotesque figure limped past the other side. It was a woman in a shattered floral sundress, her jaw hanging at a severely unnatural angle. She paused, standing less than 2 feet from my hiding spot. I gripped the steel tripod, ready to swing. She let out a low, clicking sound from her ruined throat, then slowly shuffled away. I darted to the next piece of cover, a motorized tug vehicle left abandoned in the central aisle. I slid directly underneath its heavy metal chassis just as 2 infected baggage handlers rounded the corner. I watched their heavy work boots. One dragged its left foot, leaving a thick, dark smear of blood across the concrete floor. They stopped right next to the tug. A droplet of warm, thick fluid fell from above, splashing directly onto the back of my hand. I bit my lip hard enough to taste copper to keep from screaming. One of them was bleeding out right over me. I waited for what felt like agonizing hours. Finally, a loud metallic crash echoed from the far side of the sorting room. The boots pivoted and hurried toward the noise. This was my one chance. I scrambled out from under the tug and bolted straight for the red exit sign. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. Blinding speed was my only ally. Heads immediately began to snap in my direction. Vicious hisses erupted from the shadows all around me. I was 20 feet away from the stairwell door. 10 feet. Suddenly, an infected airport mechanic lunged from behind a stack of wooden shipping pallets, its face a ruined mask of torn flesh. I didn't stop or slow down. I swung the solid steel tripod like a baseball bat, putting my entire body weight into the arc. The heavy metal connected with the side of its head with a sickening crack. shattering its skull and sending it sprawling violently into a pile of ruined suitcases. The brutal impact jarred my arms, but I kept my forward momentum. I crashed hard into the heavy fire door, slamming the push bar with my hip. The door gave way, and I practically fell headfirst into the dim stairwell. I spun around in a panic, pulling the heavy steel door shut just as a half-dozen bodies violently slammed against the other side. I fumbled frantically for the deadbolt, and shoved it home with a sharp clack. The heavy thudding against the door continued relentlessly, accompanied by a deafening cacophony of inhuman screeches. But the thick steel held strong. I leaned against the cold cinder-block wall, violently gasping for air. I had survived the baggage room. But as I looked up the spiraling concrete stairs, plunging upward into the flickering darkness, a fresh, paralyzing wave of dread washed over me. From somewhere far above, echoing down the empty concrete shaft, came the unmistakable, terrifying sound of a small child desperately crying. The crying echoed down the spiraling concrete, a fragile, trembling sound that sliced through the residual ringing in my ears. Every survival instinct I had honed over the last 12 harrowing hours screamed at me to ignore it. To sit in the dark, press my back against the heavy steel door, and wait for the world to end. Down below, the frenzied scratching and howling against the metal continued, a relentless reminder of what was waiting if the hinges gave out. But that cry, it sounded so impossibly small. It sounded like a little girl. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the bloody fire axe I had dragged out of the baggage claim carnage. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I pushed myself off the cold cinderblock wall. I couldn't just leave her. Not after everything I'd seen. I had already watched too many people die today. I began the ascent. The stairwell was suffocatingly tight, lit only by caged emergency bulbs that cast long, distorted, crimson shadows against the raw concrete. With every cautious step, the crying grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the guttural, wet gurgling of the infected. It was a genuine, terrified sob. But layered beneath it, I started to hear something else. A wet, tearing sound. The sickening crunch of bones snapping under immense pressure. Someone, or something, was up there with her. I tightened my grip on the axe handle until my knuckles turned white. I crept up the final flight of stairs, my soaked flight attendant uniform clinging to my skin, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The stairs opened up into a narrow maintenance corridor lined with thick, exposed pipes and flickering overhead fluorescent lights. The metallic scent of fresh blood hit me like a physical wall, so thick and pungent I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from loudly gagging. The corridor had been utterly demolished. Acoustic ceiling tiles had been ripped down in massive chunks, heavy electrical wires hung like gutted intestines. And the pale walls were painted with horrific, sweeping arcs of bright crimson. At the far end of the hallway, near a violently shattered ventilation grate, was the source of the noise. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, wearing a torn and dirt-smudged pink Disney princess shirt, was backed into the shallow, dark cavity of the removed air duct. She had her hands clamped tightly over her eyes, sobbing uncontrollably into her knees. And standing between me and her was the largest infected I had seen yet. It used to be an airport tactical response officer. Now, it was a walking nightmare. The heavy black tactical vest it wore was shredded, bursting at the seams from an unnatural, rapidly swelling muscle mass and pooled, coagulated black blood. Its Kevlar helmet was gone, revealing a skull that had been partially crushed and hastily rearranged by the parasitic virus. jaw unhinged to impossible proportions, it was crouched over the mutilated remains of what I assumed was the girl's parent. Mechanically tearing massive chunks of flesh from the corpse with a sickening, rhythmic ferocity. The creature stopped. The wet chewing ceased. I had accidentally kicked a loose, bloody piece of ceiling tile. The sound was practically microscopic, but in that silent, blood-soaked hallway, it might as well have been a gunshot. The monstrous former officer slowly rotated its head. Its eyes were milky white, weeping a thick, dark fluid down its cheeks. The moment it locked onto me, the jaw snapped shut, and it let out a roar that vibrated violently through the floorboards, a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. It lunged. It didn't shamble or limp like the recently turned passengers in the terminal. It exploded forward with the terrifying, explosive speed of an apex predator. I barely had time to raise the axe. The creature slammed into me like a freight train, knocking the breath from my lungs and sending me crashing backward into a heavy metal utility cart. The axe flew from my grip, skittering uselessly down the dark hallway. I felt heavy, blistered hands wrap around my throat, squeezing with an impossible, hydraulic pressure. The monster's face was inches from mine, its breath a foul hurricane of rotting meat and copper. Black ooze dripped from its jagged, broken teeth, splashing onto my cheeks as it snapped its jaws frantically, desperate to tear my throat out. I thrashed wildly, kicking my legs, driving my knees into its dense torso, but it was like fighting a brick wall. Black spots danced in the corners of my vision. My lungs screamed for oxygen. I frantically patted the floor around me, my fingers brushing against sharp debris, shattered glass, and then, the heavy, freezing steel of a large industrial pipe wrench that had tumbled from the overturned utility cart. My fingers closed around the textured grip. With the very last ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength I possessed, I swung the wrench upward in a desperate, blind arc. There was a sickening, hollow thud as the heavy steel connected with the side of the creature's already fractured skull. The crushing grip on my throat instantly loosened. The monster staggered sideways, letting out a disoriented, gargling hiss. I didn't hesitate for a microsecond. I scrambled to my feet, gasping in ragged lungfuls of stale air, raised the heavy wrench high above my head, and brought it down again, and again, and again. I struck with a primal, terrified rage, shattering bone and cartilage until the massive creature collapsed onto the linoleum, twitching violently before finally going completely still. I stood over it, my chest heaving, the wrench slipping in my slick hands. I was completely drenched in a mixture of cold sweat and infected blood. Slowly, I turned my attention back to the end of the hallway. The little girl was peering out from the shadow of the vent, her tear-streaked face pale with absolute shock. I dropped the wrench and walked toward her slowly, holding my empty hands out to show I wasn't going to hurt her. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice cracked and hoarse. "I've got you. We have to move." She hesitated for an agonizing second, then scrambled out of the vent and buried her face into my waist, her tiny arms locking around me in a death grip. I scooped her up. She was incredibly light, trembling like a leaf. As I carried her past the butchered remains of the tactical officer, retrieving my dropped axe along the way, an automated voice suddenly echoed through the corridor from a nearby, static-filled PA speaker. "Attention all remaining personnel. The quarantine has failed. Terminal 4 containment doors will be permanently sealed in exactly 15 minutes. All survivors must proceed to the rooftop extraction point immediately. May God have mercy on us all. 15 minutes." I looked down the long, shadowed hallway leading toward the main terminal concourse. The rooftop extraction point was on the opposite side of the airport, past miles of densely infected territory. I tightened my grip on the little girl, raised my axe, and began to sprint toward the unknown. The first 50 yards were a blur of adrenaline and burning lungs. The heavy fire axe in my right hand felt like a lead weight, while my left arm wrapped like a vice around the little girl trembling against my chest. Her face was buried in my torn, blood-stained uniform collar, her hot breath hitching with silent sobs. I couldn't comfort her. I couldn't even promise her we were going to make it. All I could do was run. The shadowed hallway suddenly widened, dumping us out onto the second-level mezzanine of the main terminal concourse. And the sheer scale of the nightmare below hit me like a physical blow. The atrium, once a bustling hub of excited travelers and overpriced coffee shops, was now a slaughterhouse. Thousands of the infected swarmed the lower level. They moved in a chaotic, rippling mass of twitching limbs and snapping jaws, slipping in lakes of dark, coagulating blood that painted the white marble floors. The sickening chorus of their wet, guttural clicking echoed up to the vaulted glass ceiling, magnified by the cold architecture of the airport. I pulled back from the glass railing, pressing my spine against the wall of a ransacked duty-free store. 10 minutes, the emotionless automated voice boomed from the overhead speakers, sending a violently renewed wave of agitation through the horde below. Containment doors sealing in 10 minutes. The noise of the PA system acted like a dinner bell. Hundreds of heads snapped upward simultaneously, their milky, bloodshot eyes locking onto the upper levels. A deafening roar erupted from the floor, a unified shriek of pure, rabid hunger, and the mass began to surge toward the escalators. We had to move. The rooftop access door was past the D gates, meaning we had to cross the bridge over the main food court and push through the central security checkpoint. I pushed off the wall, sprinting down the concourse, my flats slapping against the tile. We dodged overturned luggage carts, abandoned strollers, and shredded pieces of clothing. Up ahead, the glass bridge suspended over the atrium came into view. It was a terrifying bottleneck. 3 infected were already on it, wandering aimlessly among scattered suitcases. 2 were wearing the remains of airport security uniforms, their vests torn to ribbons. The 3rd was a businessman in a shredded suit, his jaw hanging at an unnatural, broken angle, a gruesome string of viscera plastered to his chin. As my footsteps echoed on the reinforced glass, they snapped their heads toward me. The businessman lunged first, sprinting with terrifying, unnatural speed, his arms flailing wildly. I didn't stop. I couldn't lose momentum. I tightened my grip on the axe handle, shifting the little girl slightly to my hip. As the businessman closed the distance, his broken jaw snapping hungrily at the air, I swung the axe in a wide, brutal arc. The heavy steel blade buried itself deep into his temple with a sickening crunch. Black blood sprayed across the glass floor, and his momentum carried him forward, tearing the axe handle from my sweaty grip. I didn't have time to retrieve it. I shoved his collapsing body into the 2 security guards, sending them tangling over a pile of hard-shell suitcases, and sprinted past them before they could untangle their flailing limbs. We reached the security checkpoint, a graveyard of overturned X-ray machines and metal detectors. 5 minutes, the system announced, and this time, it was accompanied by a deep, terrifying mechanical groan. The ground beneath my feet vibrated. At the far end of the terminal, the massive, reinforced steel containment doors were beginning to slide out from the walls. They were moving slowly, but once they shut, this entire wing would become a sealed tomb. "Hold on tight," I whispered to the girl, scrambling up the side of a conveyor belt. We crawled over the rollers, the plastic grating painfully into my kneecaps. Beneath us, the infected who had climbed the escalators began pouring into the security area. Skeletal hands reached up through the gaps in the machines, their jagged, broken nails scratching frantically at my ankles. I kicked backward, my heel connecting with something soft and wet, and threw myself over the other side of the checkpoint. We hit the ground hard, my shoulder taking the brunt of the impact, but the adrenaline masked the pain. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes locked on the D-gate corridor. The containment doors were halfway closed, the gap narrowing with agonizing speed. The screech of the metal on metal was deafening, masking the terrifying shrieks of the infected sprinting right behind us. I pushed my legs harder than I ever had in my entire life. Every muscle fiber tore, my lungs screamed for oxygen, but the gap was shrinking. 10 feet wide. 8 feet. 6 feet. The heavy steel doors ground closer together. I threw myself forward in a desperate, sliding dive just as the doors reached the 3-foot mark. The cold steel scraped the back of my ruined flight attendant jacket, tearing the fabric, but we slid through the gap on the slick tile. A fraction of a second later, the doors slammed shut with a booming finality that shook dust from the ceiling. A heavy, metallic clank signaled the locking mechanism engaging. Immediately, the steel began to dent and boom as the horde crashed into the other side, shrieking in mindless fury. But they were trapped. We were through. I laid on the floor for a precious second, gasping for air, clutching the crying child to my chest. "We did it," I breathed, though I knew it wasn't over. Just 20 feet away, illuminated by the flickering red glow of an emergency exit sign, was the heavy steel door leading to the roof access stairwell. I forced myself up, my legs trembling like jelly, and pushed the crash bar. The stairwell was pitch black, smelling heavily of ozone and aviation fuel. Above us, the unmistakable, thunderous chopping of heavy helicopter rotors vibrated through the concrete walls. Extraction. We climbed, taking the steps 2 at a time, my vision swimming from sheer exhaustion. Every step felt like lifting a boulder, but the roar of the chopper was our beacon. We reached the top landing, and I threw my entire body weight against the heavy roof door. It burst open, and we spilled out onto the rain-slicked tarmac of the terminal roof. The blast of cold, wet air was the most incredible thing I had ever felt. Brilliant, blinding white spotlights swept across the roof from a massive military transport helicopter hovering just feet above the helipad. 2 soldiers in full tactical gear were standing on the lowered rear ramp, waving frantically with glowing batons. "Move! Move! Move!" One of them screamed over the deafening roar of the rotors, aiming his assault rifle past us. I didn't look back to see if anything had followed us up the stairs. I just ran. My wet shoes slipped on the painted concrete, but strong hands grabbed me before I could fall, hauling me and the little girl up the graded metal ramp. The moment we crossed the threshold, the ramp began to raise. I collapsed onto the cold metal floor of the fuselage, wrapping my arms protectively around the child as a medic immediately rushed over to us. "You're safe now," the medic yelled over the engine noise, shining a penlight into my eyes. "You're safe." I couldn't speak. I could only hold the little girl tighter. As the helicopter banked sharply away from the airport, pulling up into the stormy night sky, I looked out the small porthole window. The entire sprawling complex of Terminal 4 was swarming with tens of thousands of them, a sea of the dead pushing against the glass, tearing each other apart in their endless, mindless hunger. Beyond the airport, the glowing skyline of the city was completely engulfed in raging fires, columns of thick black smoke rising into the clouds. There was no traffic. There were no lights in the residential grids. Only fire and darkness. It had only been 12 hours since my morning briefing. 12 hours since I handed out peanuts and poured coffee for smiling passengers. Now, the world I knew was entirely gone, replaced by a terrifying, blood-soaked reality. We had survived the first 12 hours, but looking down at the burning remains of human civilization, a chilling realization washed over me. Surviving the outbreak was only the beginning. Living in what was left behind was going to be the real nightmare.